Novel title, Closing Time. Author, Colin Jacobson. Chapter 1. Monday morning. The snow had stopped sometime before dawn, leaving Red Deer covered in the gray-blue stillness that came after a hard Alberta night. Wind pushed loose powder across the industrial park in thin ribbons. The streetlights hummed over empty roads lined with warehouses, trucking depots, welding shops, and fenced compounds full of idle equipment half buried in frost. Larry Fredrickson unlocked the front door of Prairie West Equipment at 5:42 a.m. He always noticed the time now. The lock stuck from the cold. He leaned his shoulder into the steel door and felt the familiar resistance before it gave way with a dry groan. Inside, the warehouse smelled faintly of rubber, hydraulic oil, cardboard dust, and old coffee. The overhead heaters clicked unevenly above him. For a moment he simply stood there in the dark. The building made noises before it woke up fully, pipes knocking somewhere in the back offices, the freezer-like creak of metal shelving contracting from the cold, the compressor kicking in beside the loading bay. Larry flicked on the lights. Rows of industrial fittings, belts, valves, fasteners, safety gear, and pallets stretched under the fluorescent glow. Nothing impressive, nothing modern, but every shelf represented years of accumulation, relationships, credit lines, favors, quiet compromises. His business. He removed his gloves slowly, flexing stiff fingers swollen from arthritis and cold. 51 years old, and his hands looked older than his father's had at 60. He walked toward his office carrying the same thermos he'd used for nearly 10 years. The coffee inside had already gone burnt from sitting too long on the kitchen counter while he scraped ice off the windshield. The office sat above the warehouse floor behind a scratched window overlooking the loading area. From there, Larry could watch trucks arrive without customers seeing him first. A habit he'd developed years earlier during bad stretches when creditors showed up unannounced. The desk was cluttered with invoices, packing slips, supplier catalogs, and 2 unopened envelopes he already recognized from the bank. He sat down heavily. The computer took forever to start. Outside the office window, darkness still pressed against the warehouse skylights. The whole industrial park looked abandoned at this hour. Sometimes Larry liked being the first person awake in this part of the city. Other mornings it made him feel like the last survivor of something already dying. He opened the email from Calgary again. The acquisition offer sat there in careful corporate language. Northern Allied Industrial Group formally expresses continued interest in the purchase of Prairie West Equipment Limited. He stared at the number farther down the page. Even after seeing it 3 times over the weekend, it still looked fictional, like someone had accidentally added an extra digit. Enough money to stop. That was the problem. Larry leaned back in his chair and rubbed his face hard with both hands. For years he'd imagined retirement during the worst moments. During supplier disputes, during payroll weeks where accounts barely cleared, during flu seasons where half the warehouse staff disappeared and orders piled into chaos, during the oil downturn when he'd sat alone in this office after midnight trying to decide which vendors could wait another month. He had dreamed about escape then. But now that escape had arrived, all he could think about was emptiness. The office phone rang sharply. Larry grabbed it instinctively before the second ring. Prairie West. Morning, Larry. It was Dean from Iron Ridge Fabrication. Morning. You get our order Friday? Yeah, we're short 2 couplings. Should have them by Wednesday. A pause. You hear anything about that rail strike? Only rumors. Everything's rumors now. Larry looked out over the warehouse while Dean complained about freight delays and customers refusing price increases. The conversation drifted exactly where every conversation drifted these days. Labor shortages, inflation, insurance, politics, supply chains. Men exhausted in nearly identical ways. When the call ended, Larry sat quietly again. The silence returned fast. At 6:18 the warehouse bell rang downstairs. Mitch, always early. Always angry about something. Larry watched through the office window as Mitch stomped snow from his boots near the loading bay. 58 years old, divorced twice, smoked too much, knew inventory better than anyone in the building. Larry headed downstairs. Mitch glanced up while pulling off his gloves. Heat's acting up again in the back aisle. I know. You call somebody? Guy's coming Tuesday. He said Tuesday last week too. Larry shrugged off his coat. Morning to you too. Mitch snorted. You watch the Oilers game? No. They blew another lead. Mitch studied him a second longer than usual. You look tired. Larry moved toward the coffee machine. Didn't sleep much. Bank stuff? Larry paused briefly. No, just busy. Mitch nodded like he understood more than Larry had said. Everybody here understood more than they admitted. 30 years together did that to people. By 7:30, the warehouse slowly came alive. Forklift beeps echoed across concrete. Radios crackled. Delivery drivers stomped through slush carrying manifests. Phones started ringing steadily. Larry moved through it all automatically. Customer issue, supplier call, inventory discrepancy, payroll question, somebody's overtime complaint. A shipment delayed in Edmonton. A farmer near Olds screaming about incorrect bearings. His entire life reduced to interruption management. At 10:15, he met with Cheryl in accounting. She closed the office door before sitting down. That invoice from Renshaw is 92 days now. I know. We need to do something. They're waiting on payment from Syncrude. They always are. Larry stared at the aging carpet beneath his desk. How tight? Cheryl hesitated. Tighter than you think. He nodded once. Years ago, that answer would have spiked panic straight through his chest. Now it mostly produced exhaustion. We'll get through month end, she said carefully. Larry almost laughed. That sentence had carried the entire business for 15 years. We'll get through month end. Outside his office window, snow drifted sideways across the yard. A transport truck backed toward the loading dock with a long hydraulic hiss. Cheryl studied him. You gonna tell me what's going on with Calgary? Larry looked up sharply. Who told you? Nobody. Mitch heard something from a driver. Of course he had. News traveled through industrial Alberta faster than weather. Larry leaned back slowly. Nothing finalized. But it's real? He didn't answer immediately. Finally, maybe. Cheryl folded her hands together. What happens to everybody? There it was. Not excitement, not congratulations, fear. Larry looked through the glass at his employees moving across the warehouse floor. Men and women he'd known for decades, people who'd buried parents, gone through divorces, raised kids, had surgeries, lost homes, fought addictions, survived layoffs elsewhere and ended up here. Prairie West wasn't glamorous, but it had lasted. That mattered to people. I don't know yet, he said honestly. Cheryl nodded once, though disappointment flickered briefly across her face. After she left, Larry remained motionless for a long time. The email still sat open on his monitor. Enough money to retire. Enough money to finally stop waking up at 3 a.m. wondering how to cover payroll if 2 major accounts paid late at the same time. Enough money to breathe. So why did it feel like standing at the edge of something irreversible? Around noon, he drove to a wholesale supplier near Gasoline Alley. The roads were slushy and crowded with work trucks, semis, and dirty pickups carrying ladders and compressor tanks. Winter sunlight reflected harshly off snowbanks blackened by exhaust and gravel. At a red light, Larry caught sight of himself in the rearview mirror. The face looking back seemed heavier than he remembered. Loose skin under the eyes, gray spreading unevenly through his beard, deep forehead lines permanently etched from years of concentration and stress. His father had looked old early, too. Larry remembered him coming home from the machine shop smelling like grease and cigarette smoke, lowering himself into kitchen chairs carefully because his back hurt so badly. His hands cracked open every winter from chemicals and cold metal. Dead at 58, heart attack in the parking lot behind the shop. Larry was suddenly aware that he was only 7 years younger now than his father had been when he died. The light turned green. That thought stayed with him all afternoon. By the time he pulled into his driveway after 6, darkness had already settled over the neighborhood. The house looked exactly the same as it had for years. Brown siding, 2-car garage, porch light glowing over untouched snow, safe, predictable, paid down but not paid off. Inside, Joanne stood at the stove stirring something in a cast-iron pan. You're late. Roads were bad. She nodded without turning around. The kitchen smelled like onions and fried sausage. A television murmured softly somewhere deeper in the house. Larry removed his boots slowly, his knees aching. "How was your day?" Joanne asked. "Fine." "That good, huh?" He almost smiled. Almost. She glanced at him finally. 50 years old. Hair shorter now than when they married. Reading glasses hanging from her collar. There had been a time when seeing her after work physically relaxed him. Now most evenings felt like two exhausted people managing coexistence carefully enough to avoid conflict. "You eat?" she asked. "No." Ryan called. Larry stiffened slightly. What did he want? "He's coming back." "For what?" "He lost his job." Larry walked toward the sink. "When?" He didn't say exactly. "That sounds about right." Joanne turned off the stove harder than necessary. "You could try not sounding disappointed your son's coming home." "I didn't say I was disappointed." "You didn't have to." Larry stared out the dark kitchen window toward the backyard fence lined with snow. Somewhere nearby, a snowblower droned faintly. "How long's he staying?" "I don't know, Larry." There was irritation in her voice now. Fatigue, too. "You ask a lot of questions before you ask if he's okay." Larry opened the fridge and grabbed a beer. The cold bottle felt good in his hand. "He's 30 years old," Larry said. "He'll survive losing a sales job." Joanne watched him carefully. He sounded embarrassed. Larry twisted the cap off. "World keeps turning." She looked away first. Dinner passed mostly in silence except for occasional comments about weather and groceries. The television stayed on in the next room, filling empty space with noise neither of them listened to. Later that night, Larry sat alone at the kitchen table long after Joanne had gone upstairs. One beer became 2, then 3. The house creaked quietly around him. His laptop sat open beside unpaid invoices and the acquisition proposal from Calgary. Outside, snow drifted beneath the streetlights in slow, endless waves. Larry stared at the number on the screen again. Enough money to change his life. Enough money to end the only life he understood. Chapter 2. Ryan Comes Home. Ryan comes home. Ryan arrived on Wednesday in a rented SUV with British Columbia plates and a cracked windshield. Larry saw him first through the warehouse office window, pulling into the customer lot just after lunch, too fast for the ice. The tires slid a little before catching. Ryan sat there a moment with the engine running, looking at the building like he was confirming an address he already knew. Prairie West equipment had been part of his childhood the way weather was part of childhood, always present, always determining what could or could not happen. Vacations canceled because a supplier failed, hockey games missed because somebody quit, birthdays shortened because a customer emergency came up. Larry watched his son climb out of the vehicle wearing a city coat too thin for Red Deer in January. Ryan had Joanne's face more than his, though lately Larry noticed traces of himself appearing in him. The way he squinted against glare, the way he carried stress in his jaw. Mitch looked up from a pallet near the bay door. "Well, look what Vancouver washed back." Ryan smiled tightly. "Good to see you too." Mitch laughed and shook his hand. Larry came down the stairs slower than he meant to. Ryan saw him, and the smile changed into something more careful. "Hey, Dad." "Ryan." They stood too far apart for a moment. Then Ryan stepped in and hugged him. Larry returned it awkwardly, one hand on his son's shoulder blade, already aware of Mitch pretending not to watch. "You drive straight through?" Larry asked. "Stayed in Kamloops Monday night, Calgary yesterday." "Roads okay?" "Bad near Golden." "Always are." The conversation died there. Ryan looked around the warehouse. His eyes moved over the shelving, forklifts, concrete floor, loading doors, coffee-stained counter, old Prairie West sign behind reception. "Smaller than I remember," he said. Larry felt something tighten in him. "It hasn't changed." "Yeah, maybe that's it." They went upstairs to Larry's office. Ryan sat in the visitor chair, the same chair customers used when they wanted better pricing and employees used when something had gone wrong. He looked uncomfortable in it. Larry closed the door. "Your mother says you lost your job." Ryan looked at him. "Nice to see you too. I'm asking." "No, you're starting there." Larry sat behind his desk. "Fine. How was Vancouver?" "Expensive." "How's Melissa?" "We broke up." Larry had not known that. "When?" "October. You didn't tell us?" Ryan laughed once without humor. "You and Mom aren't exactly chatty." Larry looked down at a purchase order. "What happened?" "With Melissa or the job?" "Either." Ryan rubbed both hands over his face. "The company restructured. That's what they called it. New VP came in, cut half the regional team, kept the people he brought from Toronto. I got severance, not much." "And Melissa?" "She got tired of waiting for me to become somebody else." Larry recognized the sentence as dangerous territory and avoided it. "You looking for work here?" "I don't know." "You can't not know forever." Ryan leaned back. "There he is." Larry said nothing. Ryan looked toward the warehouse floor through the glass. "I haven't even been back an hour." "You're 30. "I'm aware." "You need a plan." Ryan's eyes returned to him. "What was your plan at 30? Work until you forgot how to talk to people?" Larry felt heat rise in his neck. "My plan kept food in your mouth." "That's always the line." "Because it's true." Ryan smiled bitterly. "Yeah, everything you did was for us, even when it meant not being around us." Larry stared at him. Downstairs, the forklift backed up with a long beep. For a few seconds, the sound filled the whole office. Ryan looked away first. "Forget it!" Larry wanted to say something final, something hard enough to restore order. Instead, he reached for his coffee, found it cold, and set it down again. "You staying at the house?" "For now." "Your mother okay with that?" "She invited me." "Right." Ryan studied him. "Are you okay with it?" Larry looked at the computer screen, though nothing there required attention. "It's your home." Ryan nodded slowly. "Doesn't feel like it." The words landed quietly, without drama. That made them worse. At 3:30, Ryan left to see Joanne. Larry watched the SUV back out and disappear toward the main road. Mitch appeared in the office doorway a few minutes later. "Kid looks thin." Larry didn't answer. "Vancouver'll do that," Mitch said. "What do you need?" Mitch held up a clipboard. "Inventory counts off again on hydraulic fittings." "By how much?" "Enough." Larry took the clipboard and scanned it, grateful for numbers. Numbers could irritate him, but they did not accuse him of absence. That evening he stayed late. He told himself it was because of month-end reports, but mostly he did not want to go home yet. The warehouse emptied gradually. Radios switched off. Boots thudded toward exits. The last delivery truck pulled away. Cheryl waved from her car through falling snow. By 7, Larry was alone. He walked the aisles with the lights half off. Pallet wrap clung loose from boxes. A drip from the ceiling landed in a bucket near aisle 4. Somewhere in the back, one heater rattled like it had coins inside. He had built all this by staying when others went home. That used to sound noble to him. Now he was not sure what it sounded like. At home, Ryan's rented SUV sat in the driveway behind Joanne's car. Larry parked on the street. Inside, he heard laughter from the kitchen before he opened the inner door. Joanne's laughter, full and surprised. He stood there a second, hand still on the knob. When he entered, Ryan was sitting at the table eating stew from a large bowl. Joanne stood by the counter with a glass of wine. "You're home," she said. "Looks that way." Ryan glanced up. "Mom made enough." Larry removed his coat. "I ate." He had not. Joanne watched him but did not challenge it. Ryan had spread some papers beside his bowl. Severance documents, job listings, a notebook filled with sharp handwriting. "So what now?" Larry asked. Joanne sighed. "Larry." Ryan set down his spoon. "It's fine. He can't help himself. I asked a question. I don't know yet. I might take a few weeks. To do what? To breathe. Larry laughed under his breath. That must be nice. Ryan pushed back from the table. You know what, Dad? It actually isn't. It feels pretty awful. The kitchen went still. Ryan's face reddened, but his voice stayed low. I got walked out by security in front of people I hired. I packed my apartment into boxes because I couldn't afford to stay. My girlfriend left months ago, and I didn't tell anyone because I knew exactly how you'd look at me, like this, like I'm some lazy idiot who failed on purpose. Larry opened his mouth, then closed it. Joanne stood frozen at the counter. Ryan looked down. I'm tired, that's all. I'm just tired. The words did something strange to Larry. For a moment, Ryan was not 30. He was 11, sitting in the passenger seat of Larry's truck after a hockey practice Larry had barely made it to, staring out the window because he did not know whether to be happy or angry. Larry remembered buying him fries from the drive-thru as an apology. He had believed, at the time, that was enough. I didn't say you failed on purpose, Larry said. No, you just think it. Ryan stood and carried his bowl to the sink. I'm going to bed. After he left, Joanne remained silent for a long time. Larry opened the fridge. Don't, she said. His hand stopped on the beer. He looked at her. What? Don't stand there like this. Is some problem that walked into your house. He's your son. I know who he is. Do you? Larry shut the fridge harder than needed. I worked my ass off so he had choices. Joanne's face changed. Not anger exactly. Something more worn out. And maybe he wanted you. That quieted the room. The furnace came on. Larry looked toward the hallway where Ryan had gone. He left, Larry said. He grew up. There's a difference? Joanne picked up her wine glass but did not drink. You're getting an offer most people dream about. Your son is home. We might finally have a chance to be something other than exhausted. And you walk around like someone's taking everything from you. Larry looked at the dark kitchen window. His reflection stood there older and heavier than he expected. Maybe they are, he said. Joanne shook her head. No, Larry, maybe you gave it away one piece at a time and called it responsibility. He slept badly again. At 2:40 a.m., he woke with his heart beating hard. The house was silent except for wind pressing against the siding. Joanne slept, turned away from him. Larry stared at the ceiling. He thought about the offer from Calgary. He thought about Ryan's face across the kitchen table. He thought about his father in grease-dark coveralls, asleep in a recliner with one hand hanging open, fingers curled like they were still holding a wrench. At 3:15, Larry got up. He dressed quietly and drove without destination through Red Deer's sleeping streets, past the dark hockey arena, past the closed Tim Hortons near the highway, past rows of modest houses where blue television light flickered behind curtains, past the industrial park where Prairie West sat waiting in the snow. He pulled into the empty lot and left the truck running. The building looked smaller from the outside, too. Ryan had been right. Larry hated that. For nearly 30 years, he had believed the place looked solid, permanent, proof. Now, under the frozen streetlights, it looked like corrugated metal, debt, and habit. Larry sat there until the windshield began to fog. Then he put the truck in gear and drove home before anyone could see him. Chapter 3. The Offer. The Offer. Thursday morning brought freezing rain. By 6 o'clock, the roads were coated in dull gray ice, and the industrial park moved carefully beneath low clouds that seemed to press directly against the warehouse roofs. Trucks fishtailed through intersections. Men walked with stiff caution, carrying coffees and lunch coolers under their arms. Larry nearly slipped crossing the Prairie West parking lot. His knee twisted awkwardly, and pain shot briefly up his leg. Jesus Christ, he muttered to nobody. Inside, the warehouse heaters struggled against the cold. Moisture dripped steadily from the loading bay doors. Mitch stood near the coffee machine talking with Curtis from shipping about the weather and tire prices. Roads are a skating rink, Curtis said. City never salt's worth a damn, Mitch replied. Larry passed them with a nod. You hear from Calgary yet? Mitch asked casually. Larry stopped. About what? Mitch shrugged. People talk. People should work. Mitch grinned faintly into his coffee. Larry headed upstairs before the conversation could continue. The acquisition meeting was scheduled for 10. 2 representatives from Northern Allied Industrial Group were driving up from Calgary to discuss next-stage integration possibilities, which sounded to Larry like corporate language for deciding how much of his company they intended to dismantle after buying it. He spent the next 3 hours pretending to work while actually watching the clock. Emails blurred together, supplier notices, inventory updates, an overdue account from Leduc, a message from Joanne reminding him Ryan needed to borrow the second garage opener. At 9:47, Cheryl knocked softly and entered. They're here. Larry looked through the office window. 2 men in dark winter coats crossed the parking lot toward the front entrance, one older, silver-haired and lean, the other younger, carrying a leather laptop bag and walking too fast for the ice. Larry suddenly felt irrationally angry at both of them. They looked rested. The older man introduced himself as Graham Porter, Vice President of Expansion. The younger one was named Vic Sharma, Finance and Operations. They shook hands in the conference room beside the warehouse office. Prairie West had never really needed a conference room, so it mostly functioned as storage for old catalogs and a folding table Larry bought secondhand in 2009. Graham smiled politely around the room. You've built something very stable here. Larry nodded. We survived. Same thing these days, Graham said. Coffee was poured. Small talk happened. Road conditions, oil prices, Calgary growth. Larry watched them carefully while they spoke. Both men had the smooth alertness of people who traveled for meetings regularly and slept enough at night. Finally, Graham opened a folder. We've completed our preliminary review, he said. Overall, we're impressed. Larry hated the word preliminary. We see strong regional relationships, dependable customer retention, and solid positioning in central Alberta. Larry folded his arms. You also saw aging infrastructure and inconsistent cash flow. Graham smiled slightly. We did. And businesses like this are becoming harder to build organically. Larry said nothing. Vic slid several printed sheets across the table. We'd like to move toward formal due diligence within 30 days. Larry glanced at the documents without reading. What happens to my staff? The 2 men exchanged a quick look. There would be some operational restructuring over time, Graham said carefully. Larry leaned back. Meaning? We'd evaluate redundancies. There it is. Graham kept his voice measured. Larry, acquisitions always involve transition. These people have worked here 20 years, and we value that experience. But no immediate staffing changes are planned. Larry laughed quietly. That's not the same answer. Silence settled over the room briefly. Through the warehouse wall came the distant whine of a forklift lifting a pallet. Graham folded his hands together. You've reached a scale where succession becomes a legitimate issue. Larry looked at him sharply. Succession. You have no internal ownership transition. Your son isn't involved in the company. Larry felt irritation rise immediately. My family's not part of this discussion. Fair enough, Graham said calmly. But from a business standpoint, continuity matters. Yeah. Larry stared out the small conference room window into the warehouse. Continuity. Such a clean word for replacement. The meeting dragged on another 90 minutes. Asset valuations, inventory reconciliation, property assessments, vendor relationships. At some point, Larry stopped listening fully. The conversation became a blur of terms that made Prairie West sound less like a life and more like machinery being dismantled into categories. Toward the end, Graham closed the folder gently. You should understand something, he said. Offers like this don't stay open forever. Larry met his eyes. You trying to pressure me? No, I'm telling you markets change. The younger man, Vic, finally spoke again. You've done well building this. There's real value here. Larry almost asked a question then, not about money, about afterward, about waking up with nowhere necessary to be, about whether men disappeared slowly once nobody required them every day. But he didn't. Instead, he stood and shook their hands. Outside, freezing rain tapped steadily against the windows. "We'll be in touch next week," Graham said. Larry nodded. Then they were gone. He watched their rental SUV pull carefully onto the road and disappear toward Highway 2. For several minutes he remained standing at the front window. Mitch appeared behind him carrying packing slips. "So?" Larry didn't turn around. "So what?" "You selling?" Larry finally looked at him. "You asking as an employee or a gossip?" Mitch shrugged. "Both." Larry took the paperwork from him. "Nothing decided." Mitch studied him a second longer. "You know what happens if a big outfit buys this place?" "I know. They cut people." Larry said nothing. "They always cut people." After Mitch walked away, Larry returned upstairs and closed his office door. The room suddenly felt smaller than usual. He sat heavily at his desk and stared at the warehouse through the scratched glass. Curtis arguing with the driver, Cheryl carrying invoices toward accounting, Mitch climbing into the forklift with his bad shoulder visibly stiff, people moving through routines built over years. He tried imagining all of it belonging to someone else. The thought hollowed him out. At lunch, Larry drove alone to a diner off Gates Avenue he'd been visiting for nearly 20 years. Same booths, same cracked vinyl seats, same waitress calling everyone "hun." The lunch crowd was mostly tradesmen, retirees, oil field workers between jobs, and city employees in reflective jackets. Larry sat in the corner booth drinking coffee he did not want. The television above the counter showed business news with subtitles crawling beneath stock numbers. A story about mergers in Western Canada, consolidation, efficiency, economic uncertainty, words spoken by polished people in clean suits. Larry looked around the diner instead. A man in work coveralls rubbing his wrist repeatedly. Two older farmers eating silently in matching seed company caps. A waitress limping slightly each time she turned near the kitchen. Nobody here talked about succession planning. They talked about surviving winter. The waitress topped up his coffee. "You okay, Larry?" "Fine." "You look somewhere else." He managed a small smile. "Probably am." After lunch, he drove aimlessly for almost an hour instead of returning directly to work. Industrial roads, truck dealerships, storage yards full of rusting equipment, snow-covered fields beyond the city limits. The freezing rain had turned the world colorless. At a red light near Penhold, he remembered a conversation with his father from years ago. Larry had been 23 and exhausted from working warehouse jobs while trying to start Prairie West out of a rented bay with almost no inventory. They'd sat in his father's garage drinking beer beside an old Dodge truck that never ran properly. "You know the trick?" his father had said. Larry remembered shrugging. His father pointed a grease-blackened finger at him. "Don't kill yourself for people who replace you before your obituary's cold." At the time, Larry had dismissed it as bitterness. Now he wondered if it had simply been the most honest thing the man ever said. Back at home that evening, Ryan sat at the kitchen table with a laptop open beside a stack of printed resumes. Joanne was reading nearby. The television murmured softly from the living room. Larry entered carrying the cold air with him. "How was work?" Joanne asked. "Fine." Ryan glanced up. "You always answer like you're being interrogated." Larry removed his coat slowly. "Long day." Joanne studied him. "Meeting happen?" He looked at her sharply. "You told him?" "He's your son, not a stranger." Ryan leaned back in his chair. "So it's real?" Larry grabbed a glass from the cupboard. "Maybe. You gonna sell?" Larry poured water without answering. Ryan watched him carefully. "You want to?" The question lingered. Larry drank half the water before responding. "I don't know what I want." Ryan nodded slightly. "That's probably the first honest thing you've said in 10 years. Joanne gave him a warning look, but Larry surprised himself by not reacting. Instead, he sat down heavily across from his son. The kitchen light buzzed faintly overhead. "What would you do?" Larry asked suddenly. Ryan blinked. "With what?" "The offer." Ryan leaned back again, caught off guard. I don't know the numbers. It's enough. For retirement? Larry nodded. Ryan looked at the table a long moment. Then probably take it. The answer hit harder than Larry expected. Just like that. Ryan shrugged carefully. You've been miserable my entire life. Joanne closed her book quietly. Larry stared at his son. You think this business made me miserable? I think it became more important than everything else. Larry laughed once without humor. Easy thing to say when you never carried it. Ryan met his eyes directly. Maybe, but you carried it like if you stopped moving, everything would collapse. That's called responsibility. No, Ryan said softly. Sometimes it's fear. The room went silent. Outside, freezing rain tapped against the kitchen window. Larry looked at Joanne, expecting her to interrupt. She didn't. That bothered him more than if she had agreed aloud. Later that night, after everyone else had gone upstairs, Larry sat alone in the garage drinking a beer beside shelves full of tools he barely used anymore. The old hockey equipment still hung in one corner. Ryan's childhood skates, a broken stick, camping gear untouched for years. He looked around the cluttered space and realized how much of his life existed in storage now. Objects from futures postponed indefinitely. The cabin they never bought. The fishing trips delayed until next summer. The vacations canceled for busy season. Always later, always after one more difficult year. Larry opened another beer and sat listening to the refrigerator hum. For the first time in months, maybe years, a thought entered his mind clearly enough to frighten him. What if the business had not stolen his life? What if he had handed it over willingly because work was easier than everything else? Chapter 4. Saturday at the Rink. Saturday morning arrived sharp and painfully cold, the kind of Alberta cold that made vehicles groan awake and turned breath instantly solid in the air. The radio said -27 before wind chill. Larry believed it without needing confirmation. The windows in the kitchen had frosted white around the edges overnight. Ryan was already awake when Larry came downstairs. He sat at the table in sweatpants drinking coffee, scrolling job listings on his laptop. Joanne moved quietly around the kitchen, packing a thermos and gloves into a canvas tote bag. You're up early, Larry said. Ryan glanced at him. Could say the same. Larry ignored that. Joanne zipped the bag. Melissa's kid has a tournament today, remember? Larry frowned. Melissa who? From next door. Oh. Joanne looked at him a moment longer than necessary. You said we'd go. Larry genuinely had no memory of agreeing. What time? 9:30? At the Collicut? Yes. Ryan smirked faintly into his coffee. You look excited? Larry poured himself coffee. I spent 20 years in hockey arenas. You spent 20 years standing near exits taking phone calls. The words were casual, but landed anyway. Joanne shot Ryan a look. What? It's true. Larry drank the coffee too quickly and burned his tongue. By 9:15, they were driving through frozen suburban streets beneath a pale blue sky so cold it looked metallic. Snowbanks towered at intersections blackened by sand and exhaust. Pickup trucks rattled past carrying kids in oversized hockey bags. The parking lot at the arena was chaos. Parents hauling equipment, children wobbling across ice-covered pavement. The sharp smell of exhaust, wet winter gear, and coffee drifting through the air. Larry stepped inside and immediately felt the old familiarity hit him. Cold concrete, skate blades scraping floors, vending machine hum, voices echoing beneath high steel rafters. Hockey arenas all smelled the same. Wet gloves, stale popcorn, sweat trapped in old equipment. Ryan noticed him looking around. You miss it? Larry shrugged. Don't know. But he did. Not the hockey itself, the structure, the schedules, the years when the kids still needed rides somewhere. Melissa waved them over near the bleachers. Her son Tyler stood nearby in full gear, looking terrified. Morning, she said brightly. Joanne hugged her. Ryan nodded politely. Larry shook Tyler's glove awkwardly. Nervous? The kid nodded. That's normal. Tyler looked unconvinced. They settled into the stands among bundled parents drinking Tim Hortons coffee from oversized cups. The game itself barely mattered. 8-year-olds crashing into boards, coaches yelling encouragement nobody listened to, parents applauding randomly. Larry watched Tyler skate hard for every puck and remembered Ryan at that age. Gap-toothed grin, 2 small shoulder pads, looking constantly toward the stands to make sure his father was watching. A heaviness settled quietly in Larry's chest. Beside him, Ryan leaned forward on his knees. "I remember this rink." Larry nodded. "You threw up before tryouts here one year." Ryan laughed softly. "I forgot that." "You cried too." "Thanks. You still made the team." Ryan watched the ice a moment. "You came late." Larry stiffened slightly. "What?" "To the tryouts. You missed the first half." Larry remembered immediately. A supplier issue, a late shipment, an employee not showing up, something that had felt critical at the time. "I got there." "Yeah." Ryan kept watching the game. "I just remember staring at the doors every shift." Larry looked down at his hands, dry cracked knuckles, swollen joints. He suddenly hated how clearly he remembered the invoice problem from that same day. Numbers and logistics preserved perfectly while entire pieces of his son's childhood existed only as fragments. A whistle shrieked across the rink. Parents clapped. Tyler fell trying to stop and slid awkwardly into the boards. Everyone laughed gently. Larry found himself smiling despite everything. After the game, they gathered in the lobby while kids ran screaming between benches. Melissa chatted with Joanne about school schedules and rising grocery prices. Ryan wandered toward the concession stand. Larry stood alone watching families move through the building. A father kneeling to tighten skates, a teenager carrying 3 hockey bags at once, mothers yelling for kids to stop running. Normal life happening in loud, ordinary pieces. "Larry?" He turned. Doug Hensley stood nearby in a heavy winter coat holding 2 coffees. Larry hadn't seen him in nearly a year. Doug looked older now, thinner through the face, gray spreading unevenly through his beard. They shook hands. "How have you been?" Doug asked. "Working." Doug laughed quietly. Still. Doug had owned an electrical supply company across town before selling it 5 years earlier. Larry remembered the rumors afterward. Depression, drinking, a separation, then eventually a quieter rumor that Doug had stabilized somehow. "You retired life treating you okay?" Larry asked carefully. Doug considered the question seriously. "First year? No." Larry nodded before he could stop himself. Doug noticed. "Thinking about it?" "Maybe." Doug handed him one of the coffees. "They offer enough?" Larry almost smiled. "That obvious?" "You've got the same look I had." "What look?" "Like somebody told you the ground under your feet isn't permanent." They stood watching children race through the lobby. "How bad was it?" Larry asked. Doug sipped coffee. "Retirement?" Larry nodded. Doug exhaled slowly through his nose. "You spend 30 years solving problems every day. Then one morning, nobody needs anything from you." Larry stared toward the rink doors. "What did you do?" "Drank too much, wandered around Canadian Tire, started arguments with my wife over stupid shit." Larry laughed, despite himself. Doug smiled faintly. "Thought freedom would feel bigger than it did." "And now?" Doug shrugged. "Now it's quieter." "That's supposed to sound encouraging?" "It's supposed to sound true." Before Larry could respond, Ryan returned carrying hot chocolates. Doug recognized him immediately. "Jesus, Ryan?" Ryan smiled politely. "Hey, Doug. You're grown up. That's depressing." "Been hearing that a lot." Doug shook his hand. "How's Vancouver?" Ryan hesitated briefly. "I'm back for a while." Doug nodded in the way older men do when they understand more than the sentence contains. "Well, good luck to both of you." Larry watched him walk away through the crowded lobby. Ryan handed over a hot chocolate. "What was that about?" "Nothing." Ryan studied him. "That guy sold his company, didn't he?" Larry looked toward the parking lot through the glass doors where snow blew across idling vehicles. Yeah. How'd it go for him? Larry remembered Doug's face just now. Tired, but calmer somehow. Don't know yet. That afternoon, Larry drove alone out toward Sylvan Lake while Joanne and Ryan stayed home. He told himself he needed air. Mostly, he needed distance. The highway cut through frozen farmland under a hard white sky. Snow drifted across open fields in ghostly waves. Oil pump jacks moved slowly in the distance like exhausted machinery refusing to stop. Larry turned off onto a rural road without really deciding to. The truck heater blasted dry air against his face. He passed farmhouses half hidden by trees, frozen ponds, abandoned barns collapsing inward under years of weather. His father would have liked this drive, or maybe not liked it exactly, understood it. Men of his father's generation drove aimlessly when things sat wrong inside them. They called it clearing their heads because they lacked language for anything more precise. Larry pulled onto a gravel turnout overlooking a wide frozen field. The silence out there felt enormous. He shut off the truck. Immediately the cold began creeping inward through the doors and windows. For several minutes he simply sat staring across the empty prairie. He thought about Doug saying, "Nobody needs anything from you." He thought about Ryan waiting for him at hockey tryouts. He thought about Joanne growing older beside him while entire decades disappeared into payroll cycles and inventory reports. A terrifying possibility began forming slowly beneath all of it. What if he had built Prairie West, not because he loved the business, but because constant work protected him from confronting the rest of his life? The thought made him deeply uncomfortable. His phone buzzed. Joanne. "You okay?" she asked when he answered. "Yeah." "Where are you?" "Driving." A pause. "You do that a lot lately." Larry watched snow move across the field like smoke. "I know." "You coming home for dinner?" He almost said he was busy. The lie reached his mouth automatically, then stopped. "Yeah," he said finally. "I'll be home." When he pulled into the driveway an hour later, Ryan was outside trying to scrape ice from the rental SUV windshield with an old CD case. Larry stood watching a second before walking over. "That won't work." Ryan laughed. "It's what I found." Larry opened the garage and grabbed a proper scraper from the wall. For a moment, they worked silently side by side in the cold. Then Ryan spoke without looking at him. "You really thinking of selling?" Larry scraped hard at the glass. "Maybe." Ryan nodded. "I think you should." Larry looked at him sharply. "Why?" Ryan leaned against the SUV. "Because I don't think this place owns you anymore." The sentence irritated him instantly. "You think it's that simple?" "No." Ryan shoved his hands into his coat pockets. "I think you're scared because you don't know who you are without people depending on you." Larry stared at him. The cold air burned inside his lungs. "You think you know me pretty well for someone who spent the last 10 years gone." Ryan met his eyes. Maybe leaving made it easier to see. Chapter 5. Month End. The last week of January arrived with dirty snowbanks, gray skies, and the particular exhaustion that settled over Prairie West during month end. Invoices stacked faster than payments arrived. Customers suddenly became impossible to reach. Suppliers who had ignored Larry's calls for years now wanted updates immediately because everyone everywhere seemed nervous about cash. By Tuesday morning, the office felt tight with pressure. Phones ringing nonstop, printers jamming, forklifts backing up in sharp electronic bursts. Cheryl moving through accounting with the clipped efficiency of someone trying not to panic visibly. Larry spent most of the day putting out small fires. An oil field contractor disputed a shipment. A delivery truck broke down near Lacombe. One of the warehouse heaters failed completely. Curtis called in sick. By noon, Larry had consumed 4 coffees and half a pack of antacids. At 1:15, Cheryl entered his office carrying a folder. "We need to talk." He already hated the sentence. She closed the door behind her. The line of credits nearly maxed. Larry rubbed his forehead. "How nearly?" She handed him the sheet. The number sat there flat and undeniable. "We're waiting on over 300,000 in receivables," Cheryl said. "If Renshaw and Talbot both delay again, payroll gets ugly." Larry stared at the page. Payroll gets ugly. Another phrase from the private language of small businesses, meaning people who trusted you might not get paid on time. "Okay," he said quietly. "Okay, what?" "We move money around until Friday." "There isn't much left to move." Larry leaned back in his chair. Outside the office window, Mitch argued with a driver beside the loading dock, both men waving paperwork angrily in the cold. "How long have we been doing this?" Larry asked suddenly. Cheryl blinked. "What?" "This. Barely holding shit together." She gave a tired smile. "Since 1998. He laughed once through his nose. "Sounds about right." Her expression softened slightly. "You thinking more about Calgary?" Larry looked away. "Every hour." After she left, he remained motionless at his desk. For years, this kind of pressure energized him. Fear sharpened him. Problems gave shape to the day. Now it mostly made him tired. He opened the acquisition proposal again. The number no longer looked fictional. It looked like escape. That realization unsettled him almost as much as the thought of retirement itself. At 4:30, Ryan appeared unexpectedly at the warehouse. Larry saw him downstairs talking with Mitch near receiving. Ryan wore a winter jacket and carried 2 coffees. Mitch noticed Larry watching from the office window and pointed upward with obvious amusement. A minute later, Ryan knocked lightly and entered. "Brought coffee." Larry eyed the cup suspiciously. "What do you want?" Ryan smiled faintly. "Good to know we're still connecting emotionally." Larry took the coffee anyway. Ryan looked around the office. "I forgot how depressing this room is." "It's an office." "It's a hostage situation with filing cabinets." Larry almost smiled, despite himself. Ryan sat down across from him. "Mom said things are tense." "Things are always tense." Ryan nodded toward the warehouse. "Mitch gave me the tour." "Tour?" He mostly complained. "That sounds like Mitch." Ryan looked through the glass at the warehouse floor. "I used to think this place was huge." "It was to you." Ryan nodded slowly. "You ever think about how weird memory is?" Larry frowned. "What do you mean?" Ryan shrugged. "When you're a kid, your parents seem permanent, like they know what they're doing. Then one day you realize they were just stressed people improvising." Larry studied him carefully. "That what you think I was?" Ryan laughed quietly. "I think you were terrified all the time." The accuracy irritated him. "I kept this place alive." "I know." "No, you don't." Larry leaned forward. "You remember growing up around the business? Fine. You remember me missing hockey games? Fine. What you don't remember is me sitting in this office wondering if we'd lose the building, wondering if I could make payroll, wondering if one bad quarter would wipe out 20 years. Ryan listened without interrupting. "I signed personal guarantees against the house more than once," Larry continued. "Your mother didn't even know how close things got sometimes." The room went quiet. Ryan looked genuinely surprised. "You never told us." Larry laughed harshly. "What was I supposed to say? Hey kids, maybe we lose everything because Dad bet his life on industrial fittings?" Ryan stared at the floor briefly. Then, "I think maybe you should have told somebody." The sentence landed harder than Larry expected, because part of him knew it was true. At 6, Larry finally shut down the office and drove home through blowing snow. The city looked exhausted, strip malls glowing beneath dirty ice, cars lined up endlessly at drive-thrus, people hauling groceries through parking lots with shoulders hunched against the wind. Everything felt temporary suddenly, as if the entire world ran on quiet desperation and automatic payments. At home, Joanne had made stew again. Ryan sat at the table reading job postings. The television played softly in the living room. Normal evening, familiar evening. Larry suddenly wondered how many thousands exactly like it had disappeared while he thought he was working toward some future that never fully arrived. Dinner passed quietly until Joanne mentioned the cabin. "We drove past Lesser Slave on our honeymoon," she said suddenly. Larry looked up. "What?" "The cabin. You mentioned it again the other day." Ryan glanced between them. Joanne continued carefully. "You used to talk about buying land up there." Larry remembered. Not clearly, but enough. "You wanted a dock," he said. She smiled faintly. "You wanted a fishing boat we couldn't afford." Ryan looked almost uncomfortable witnessing the memory. "What happened?" he asked. Neither answered immediately. Finally, Larry shrugged. "Life?" Joanne looked down at her bowl. "No," she said softly. "Work." The room settled into silence again. Later that night, Ryan went out with old friends from high school. Joanne watched television upstairs. Larry sat alone in the garage drinking beer beside shelves full of forgotten projects. A broken snowblower, paint cans hardened shut, fishing rods gathering dust. He looked at his hands resting on his knees. Hands built for labor. Hands that always needed something to repair, carry, tighten, move. What happened to men like him when there was nothing left requiring maintenance? His phone buzzed. A text from Graham Porter in Calgary. "Hope you're considering everything carefully. We'd like to move forward soon." Larry stared at the message. Then typed, still thinking. He erased it. Typed again. Need more time. Erased that too. Finally, he put the phone face down without replying. Around 11:30, he heard Ryan come home, muted voices downstairs, a refrigerator opening, then footsteps toward the garage. Ryan opened the door carrying 2 beers. "It's freezing out here." Larry accepted one silently. Ryan sat on an old folding chair nearby. For a while, neither spoke. The garage heater clicked unevenly overhead. Finally, Ryan said, "I saw Kevin tonight." "Kevin who?" "From hockey." Larry vaguely remembered a skinny kid with braces. "He's an electrician now. 2 kids." "Good for him." Ryan rolled the beer bottle between his palms. "You know what's weird?" Larry waited. "He said he always thought you were intimidating." Larry laughed. "Me? You barely talk to anybody." "I was busy." Ryan nodded slightly. "That's kind of my point." Larry took a drink. "You got kids. Eventually, you'll understand." Ryan looked at him. "Maybe, but I don't think being scared all the time made you a bad father." Larry stared at him. The sentence arrived without accusation. That made it harder to deflect. Ryan leaned back in the chair. "I think you thought love was providing things." Larry looked away toward the dark garage wall. "My old man never even did that much." "I know." "No, you don't." Larry's voice roughened unexpectedly. "My father worked himself into the ground for people who forgot him immediately afterward. I swore I wouldn't end up broke like him." Ryan listened quietly. "And now?" Larry looked at the beer in his hand. The condensation glistened beneath the weak overhead light. "Now I don't know what any of it was for." The garage stayed silent except for the heater ticking softly as it cooled. Ryan finally spoke. "Maybe it doesn't have to be for one thing." Larry shook his head faintly. "That sounds like something people say when they're young." Ryan smiled sadly. "Maybe. Or maybe it's something people forget when they're tired." After Ryan went inside, Larry remained in the garage another hour. He thought about his father dying in a parking lot before retirement. He thought about Prairie West swallowing entire decades one invoice at a time. He thought about the terrifying possibility that selling the business might not destroy him, and somehow, that possibility frightened him most of all. Chapter 6. Inventory. The warehouse smelled like wet cardboard and diesel exhaust. Larry stood beside aisle 7 at 6:10 on Thursday morning, watching Mitch count hydraulic couplings with visible irritation. Inventory week always made everyone miserable. Numbers that looked fine on screens suddenly became physical problems once people started counting actual shelves. "Still off," Mitch muttered. "By how much?" Enough that somebody's either stealing or stupid. Larry glanced at the clipboard. Probably stupid. Mitch snorted. Optimistic today. The heaters rattled overhead. Outside, darkness still pressed against the loading bay windows. Snow blew sideways through the yard beneath the security lights. Larry rubbed sleep from his eyes. He had been awake since 3 again. Not anxious exactly, something worse, restless. He could feel himself circling thoughts he could not settle. Sell, don't sell, keep working. For what? The questions followed him constantly now, humming beneath ordinary tasks like machinery vibrations through concrete floors. By 8:30, the warehouse was fully alive. Curtis had returned from whatever flu or hangover kept him home earlier in the week. Cheryl moved between accounting and reception carrying stacks of paperwork. Phones rang steadily. Delivery drivers tracked slush across the floors. Larry moved through it all automatically. Approve order, answer complaint, call supplier, discuss freight. Every action practiced into muscle memory after 30 years. At 10, a customer named Paul Renwick arrived unannounced. Larry saw him through the office window and immediately felt his stomach tighten. Renwick owned a fabrication company near Blackfalds and currently owed Prairie West nearly $90,000. The man climbed the stairs heavily, carrying his winter weight beneath an expensive work jacket. Larry, Paul. They shook hands. Renwick sat down without invitation. I need another extension. Larry leaned back slowly. You're already past 90 days. I know. You said Syncrude money was coming. It is coming. That's what you said before Christmas. Renwick rubbed his face. Things are tight. Larry almost laughed at the absurdity of the phrase. Every man in Alberta over 40 seemed to use the same exhausted vocabulary eventually. Things are tight. Just trying to get through month end. Couple bad quarters. Temporary slowdown. Different ways of describing the same endless pressure. How bad? Larry asked. Renwick hesitated. Bad enough my bank's asking questions. Larry looked out over the warehouse floor. 10 years earlier, he would have extended the credit immediately. That was how relationships worked in this business. Men carried each other through difficult periods because eventually everyone had one. Now all he could think about was Cheryl's face yesterday discussing payroll. I can give you another month, Larry said finally. Relief flashed visibly across Renwick's face. I appreciate it. Larry nodded but felt no satisfaction. After Renwick left, Cheryl entered almost immediately. You extended him again? Larry sighed. You listening at doors now? The walls are thin. He'll pay, or he won't. Larry looked at her sharply. You want me to cut off half our customers? I want you to stop acting like it's still 2006. The sentence irritated him because it was true. There had been years when work felt endless and money seemed permanently available somewhere down the road. Expansion years, oil boom years, years when everybody bought trucks they could barely afford and talked about acreage properties over steak lunches. Prairie West had grown during those years. So had Larry's belief that effort alone guaranteed survival. Now the entire province felt older, tired, more cautious, like everyone had quietly realized the boom might never fully return. At lunch, Larry drove toward the river valley and parked near Bower Ponds. The walking paths were nearly empty in the cold. A few bundled people moved slowly beside the frozen water while bare trees cracked softly in the wind. He sat in the truck eating a sandwich Joanne packed without asking if he wanted one. Across the river, smoke drifted from industrial buildings into the pale sky. His phone buzzed. Graham Porter again. Just checking in. We'd like clarity soon regarding next steps. Larry stared at the message. Then, before thinking too hard, he called him. Graham answered immediately. Larry, good timing. Yeah. How are you feeling about things? Larry watched a crow hop across the frozen parking lot. I don't know. A brief silence. That hesitation usually means something specific, Graham said carefully. Larry almost hung up. Instead, he surprised himself by speaking honestly. What happens after? After acquisition? After I leave? Graham paused longer this time. Well, That depends on you. What's that supposed to mean? I've seen owners retire successfully. I've also seen men fall apart. Larry laughed quietly. Comforting. I'm being serious. So am I. Wind rocked the truck slightly. Graham's voice softened. You built your identity around being necessary. Most founders do. The directness unsettled Larry. You some kind of psychologist now? No, just old enough to recognize patterns. Larry looked out at the frozen river. What if I don't know how to stop? Then eventually your body decides for you. The sentence stayed with him after the call ended. Eventually your body decides for you. His father's heart attack returned to him immediately. The image had faded over years, but never disappeared completely. The call from the machine shop. Joanne crying quietly in the kitchen while Larry stared at nothing. The funeral full of exhausted men smelling faintly of cigarettes and cold air. His father had been 58. Larry was 51 now. 7 years. That thought followed him back to work. That evening, Prairie West stayed busy late because of inventory counts. By 7:30, only Larry, Mitch, and Cheryl remained. The warehouse felt different at night, larger, lonelier. The constant daytime noise replaced by isolated sounds echoing through open space. Mitch climbed down from the forklift, rubbing his shoulder. I'm too old for this shit. Larry sat on a pallet nearby, holding count sheets. You've said that every year since 2003. Yeah, well, I mean it now. Cheryl walked over carrying a calculator. You both smell like dust and regret. Mitch laughed. Larry smiled faintly despite himself. For a few minutes they talked the way longtime co-workers sometimes do after hours. Looser, less guarded. Stories from old jobs, terrible customers. Employees who disappeared mid-shift and never returned. At one point, Mitch lit a cigarette outside the loading bay and stood staring into the dark yard. You sell this place, he said without turning around. I'm done. Larry leaned against the doorway. You could stay. For who? Larry had no answer. Mitch took another drag. Big companies don't keep people like me around long. You don't know that. I absolutely know that. Snow swirled through the parking lot beneath the lights. Mitch flicked ash onto the concrete. You remember Dennis? Larry nodded. Dennis had worked receiving for years before dying from cancer 3 winters earlier. Guy gave 30 years to this place, Mitch said. You know what his wife told me after the funeral? Larry stayed quiet. She said Prairie West was the only place he ever felt useful. The words hit Larry unexpectedly hard. Mitch looked at him finally. That's the dangerous part, Larry. Before Larry could respond, Cheryl called from inside. Either help count inventory or start kissing dramatically. I want to go home. Mitch laughed and crushed out the cigarette. By 9:30 they finished. The warehouse lights shut off row by row until only the office remained illuminated. Larry stood alone for a moment before leaving. The shelves stretched away into darkness. Boxes, machinery, parts. 30 years of accumulated labor and anxiety. He tried imagining someone else owning all of it. The thought no longer felt impossible. At home, he found Joanne asleep on the couch beneath a blanket, television flickering silently across her face. Ryan sat at the kitchen table with paperwork spread around him. Job applications? Larry asked quietly. Ryan nodded. Calgary mostly. Larry removed his coat slowly. You moving back there? Maybe. The answer bothered him more than expected. You just got here. Ryan looked at him carefully. I can't stay forever. Larry nodded once. Of course not. Children return temporarily now, like weather systems passing through. Ryan studied him. You okay? Larry almost gave the automatic answer. Fine. Instead, he sat heavily across from him. I don't know. Ryan waited. Larry rubbed both hands over his face. What if selling's a mistake? Ryan considered before answering. What if not selling is? The kitchen stayed quiet, except for the refrigerator humming softly nearby. Larry looked toward Joanne sleeping in the other room. She waited a long time for me to slow down. Ryan followed his gaze. Then maybe you should. Larry laughed tiredly. You make everything sound simple. No, Ryan said gently. I just think you've been making everything hard for so long that you forgot there's a difference. Later, unable to sleep again, Larry went downstairs around 2 a.m. and stood alone in the kitchen drinking water in darkness. The house creaked softly around him. Outside, snowplows scraped distant streets. He looked at the refrigerator covered in old magnets, faded family photos, appointment reminders. An ordinary life. Not perfect. Not ruined either. For years, he had acted as though one catastrophic mistake would destroy everything. But standing there in the dark kitchen at 51 years old, Larry began suspecting life was less dramatic and far sadder than that. Most damage happened quietly, over decades, one postponed conversation at a time. Chapter 7. The Highway. The call came Friday at 5:12 a.m. Larry was already awake, lying beside Joanne listening to the furnace cycle on and off when his phone vibrated on the nightstand. He answered immediately. Prairie West. A pause. Then Cheryl's voice. Sorry, I know it's early. Larry sat up. What happened? One of the delivery trucks hit the ditch outside Innisfail. His chest tightened automatically. Anybody hurt? Curtis says the driver's okay. Truck's stuck bad, though. Larry rubbed his eyes hard. Jesus. He's waiting for a tow. I'll head down. You don't have to. I'm up. He dressed quietly in darkness while Joanne stirred beside him. What is it? She asked sleepily. Truck issue. She looked at the clock. Of course. Outside, the cold felt brutal even through layers. The truck engine protested before turning over. Snow blew across the street in dry sheets beneath orange streetlights. The highway south was nearly empty. Semis moved through darkness like enormous animals, headlights glowing through drifting snow. Larry drove with both hands tight on the wheel while the radio murmured weather warnings and road conditions. This used to feel normal. Emergencies before sunrise. Problems requiring immediate action. A strange sense of purpose attached to inconvenience. Now all he could think about was how tired he felt. Curtis stood beside the stranded delivery truck near a snowy ditch outside Innisfail, stamping his boots against the cold while a tow operator worked chains beneath the trailer. You okay? Larry asked after climbing out. Curtis nodded. Guy in front of me hit ice. The truck leaned awkwardly toward the ditch, Prairie West logo half covered in frozen slush. Larry looked at the scene under flashing amber lights. Snow, diesel fumes, cold burning inside his lungs. He suddenly imagined dying on this highway someday over inventory shipments and overdue invoices. The thought arrived casually, almost logically. And once it appeared, he could not shake it. You should have stayed home, Curtis said. Larry shrugged. What else was I doing? Curtis laughed faintly. Fair point. They stood in silence while the tow truck strained against the frozen ditch. The sky slowly lightened behind low clouds. By the time Larry got back to Red Deer, the city was fully awake. Morning commuters crowded intersections. Coffee drive-thrus wrapped around buildings. Workers in reflective jackets hurried through parking lots carrying thermoses and exhaustion. He drove straight to Prairie West. Inside, the warehouse buzzed with normal activity already. Nobody paused because one truck slid into a ditch. Problems happened. Work continued. Larry stood in the office doorway watching everyone move through routines they knew by heart. Mitch loading inventory, Cheryl arguing with a supplier on the phone, Curtis recounting the highway incident dramatically to anyone listening. The place functioned almost independently now. That realization should have reassured him. Instead, it made him feel strangely unnecessary. Around noon, Graham Porter called again. Larry almost ignored it. Instead, he answered, You catch me at a bad time? Graham asked. There aren't good times anymore. A brief laugh from the other end. Fair enough. Larry shut his office door. What do you need? We're finalizing expansion budgets next week. I need to know whether we should continue allocating resources toward Prairie West. Corporate language again. Resources. Allocating. As if 30 years of Larry's life existed inside a spreadsheet column somewhere. You offering the same number? Larry asked. Yes. Larry stared through the office window at the warehouse. Mitch was helping Curtis strap down a shipment. Both men moved stiffly in the cold, bodies shaped by decades of physical labor. What happens to my people? Larry asked quietly. Graham exhaled slowly. Some would stay. Some. We'd evaluate redundancies over time. Larry closed his eyes briefly. And me? What about you? You expect me to disappear immediately? You could stay through transition if you wanted. Larry almost laughed. Transition. Another temporary word for replacement. How long before you phase me out too? Silence. Then Graham answered honestly. Probably a year. Larry appreciated the honesty, even while hating it. After the call, he remained seated for a long time. 1 year. Then what? Golf? Fishing? Watching television until his body softened into old age? He tried imagining weekdays without Prairie West and felt something close to vertigo. At lunch, he drove north without deciding where. Past gasoline stations and chain restaurants, past industrial yards and frozen fields. The highway stretched gray and endless beneath the winter sky. Eventually, he found himself outside the old machine shop where his father had worked most of his life. The building still stood near an aging industrial block on the edge of town. Different company now. Different sign. Same cracked parking lot. Larry parked across the street. Snow drifted against chain-link fencing. Men in coveralls moved inside the shop through dirty windows, silhouettes blurred by fluorescent light and welding sparks. His father had spent nearly 30 years there, then died, then been replaced. The world barely paused. Larry sat, gripping the steering wheel. A memory surfaced suddenly. He was 16, waiting in this same parking lot after school because his father's truck wouldn't start again. His father exiting the building slowly, shoulders sagging beneath his work coat. You waiting long? He'd asked. Larry remembered shrugging. Then his father standing beside the dead truck staring at the engine compartment before laughing quietly to himself. What? Larry had asked. His father wiped grease from his hands. Funny thing is, one day you realize work will take every piece you're willing to hand over. At 16, Larry had not understood. At 51, sitting across from the same building, he finally did. His phone rang again. Joanne this time. You alive? She asked. Barely. You forget dinner with Claire tonight? Larry had forgotten completely. His sister-in-law's birthday dinner at Montana's. Families, kids, noise. What time? 6:30. Larry checked the dashboard clock. Already after 4. I'll come home first. Good. A pause. You sound strange. Tired. You're always tired. The sentence stayed with him after the call ended. That night, the restaurant was loud with families escaping winter boredom. Children coloring menus, teenagers staring at phones, hockey highlights playing silently on mounted televisions. Larry sat beside Joanne at the long table while conversations moved around him in overlapping waves. Claire discussing renovations, her husband complaining about interest rates, someone asking Ryan about Vancouver, everyone aging visibly beneath restaurant lighting. At one point, Joanne touched Larry's arm lightly. You okay? He looked at her. For a moment, he saw not the familiar routines between them, but the accumulated years underneath. The apartments before the house, the cheap furniture, the fights about money, the hopes postponed so long they quietly transformed into habit. Yeah, he said. But his voice sounded distant even to himself. Later, while everyone else talked dessert menus, Ryan leaned toward him. You're somewhere else tonight. Larry stared across the restaurant. A server wiped down empty tables near the bar. An older man ate alone beneath a television showing curling highlights. I drove past Grandpa's old shop today. Ryan nodded slowly. How come? Larry considered the question. Don't know. But that wasn't true either. He knew exactly why, because for the first time in his life, he could see the outline of his own ending beginning to form. Not death necessarily, disappearance, the slow fading of usefulness. Ryan watched him carefully. You think he regretted it? Larry frowned. Who? Grandpa, working all the time. Larry looked down at the table. His father had rarely spoken emotionally about anything. Love came through repairs, rides to school, money slipped quietly onto kitchen counters during difficult months. A generation of men translating feeling into labor because they lacked another language. Probably, Larry said finally. Ryan nodded. Do you? The restaurant noise blurred briefly around him. Larry looked toward Joanne, laughing at something Claire had said. He thought about Prairie West, the warehouse before sunrise, the endless stress, the years disappearing one invoice at a time. Then he thought about hockey arenas missed halfway through games, camping trips canceled, conversations postponed until they vanished entirely. I don't know, he admitted quietly. And for once, the answer felt honest enough to matter. Chapter 8. Sunday Drive. Sunday arrived warmer. Not warm exactly, but warm enough for the snowbanks to sag and drip beneath pale sunlight. Water ran along gutters in narrow gray streams. The city smelled faintly of melting ice, wet pavement, and exhaust. Larry woke late for once. Almost 8. The house was quiet, except for the coffee maker downstairs. He lay there staring at the ceiling, disoriented by the unfamiliar feeling of having slept through the night. Beside him, Joanne's side of the bed was already empty. When he went downstairs, he found her sitting at the kitchen table in sweatpants reading a flyer from Canadian Tire while drinking coffee. You're alive, she said. Barely. She smiled faintly. It struck him suddenly how much of their marriage now depended on small, dry humor exchanged around exhaustion. Ryan still sleeping? He asked. Think so. Larry poured coffee and stood at the counter looking out the window. The neighborhood had softened overnight. Snow sliding from roofs, kids dragging hockey nets onto driveways, someone washing road salt off a pickup truck despite the weather still being January cold. Joanne watched him over her mug. You seem calmer today. I slept. Maybe you should try that more often. He nodded absently. Then, before thinking too hard, You want to drive somewhere? She blinked. What? Just drive. To where? Larry shrugged. Anywhere. She studied him carefully, suspicious of sudden changes in behavior after decades of predictability. Are you having some kind of breakdown? He laughed unexpectedly. Probably. But he meant it lightly enough that she smiled. By 10 they were heading northwest out of Red Deer beneath low winter sunlight. Ryan had declined coming along, muttering something about job applications and needing a shower. The highway stretched through open fields, patched white and brown beneath thawing snow. Grain elevators stood against the horizon like fading landmarks from another century. Trucks thundered past carrying equipment north toward oil country. Joanne adjusted the heater vent toward her feet. We haven't done this in years. Larry kept his eyes on the road. I know. When's the last time? He thought about it. Honestly, thought. I don't remember. That silence alone answered the question. They drove for nearly 40 minutes before Joanne spoke again. You really thinking of selling? Larry tightened both hands on the steering wheel. Yeah. The admission felt heavier, spoken aloud. She looked out the passenger window at frozen pasture land passing by. How serious? Pretty serious. Joanne nodded slowly but said nothing. That unsettled him more than arguing would have. You want me to? He asked finally. She laughed softly. You know what's strange? What? For years I wanted you to slow down more than anything. Larry glanced at her briefly. And now? Now I'm not sure either. He frowned. Why? Joanne rubbed her hands together for warmth. Because work became your whole personality, Larry, and I don't know what happens when that disappears. The honesty landed hard because it mirrored his own fear exactly. They passed through a small town where faded storefronts lined the highway beside a gas station and closed diner. Larry remembered when places like this felt busy during the boom years, men flooding north for oil work, new trucks everywhere, restaurants packed at 6 in the morning. Now many buildings sat empty, for lease signs faded in windows. Alberta itself seemed older somehow, tired in the bones. "You remember that campground near Rocky?" Joanne asked suddenly. Larry blinked. "Which one?" "The one where Ryan caught the fish and cried because he thought it was dead." Larry laughed before he could stop himself. "Oh, Jesus. You made him apologize to the fish." "I did not." "You absolutely did." He shook his head, smiling faintly. For a moment they felt younger. Not young exactly, but less buried beneath years. "You know what I remember," Joanne said. "What?" "You checking your voicemail from the payphone every 2 hours." The smile faded slightly. "Sorry." She shrugged. "You always thought if you stopped paying attention everything would collapse." "Sometimes it almost did." "I know." That surprised him. He glanced at her. "What do you mean?" Joanne stared ahead through the windshield. "You think I didn't know when things were bad?" Larry felt his stomach tighten. "I hid most of it." "No, you hid details, not fear." The road hummed beneath the tires. "You used to wake up in the middle of the night and just stand in the kitchen," she continued quietly. "You thought I didn't hear you." Larry said nothing. "There were years where you barely spoke to anybody unless it was about work. Even the kids noticed." He swallowed hard. "I was trying to keep everything together." "I know." Again, not accusation. That somehow made it worse. They stopped for lunch at a small diner outside Drayton Valley. The place smelled like bacon grease, coffee, and damp winter coats. A hockey game played silently on the television above the counter while a waitress refilled mugs automatically without asking. Mostly older men eating alone. Retired farmers, truck drivers, oil field workers between shifts. Larry looked around and felt an uncomfortable recognition. Versions of himself scattered across the room. Men shaped by routine labor and long winters. Men who often seemed most comfortable discussing weather and machinery because larger emotions remained trapped somewhere beneath generations of silence. Joanne stirred cream into her coffee. "You know what scares me?" Larry looked up. "What?" "You retire and still disappear somehow." The sentence settled heavily between them. "I'm right here," he said quietly. "Physically sure." He looked away. Outside the diner window, snowmelt dripped steadily from the roof. A transport truck idled beside diesel pumps. Joanne folded her hands around the mug. "I spent a lot of years waiting for later." Larry felt something twist painfully inside him. He wanted to defend himself, wanted to explain pressure and payroll and debt and fear. Instead, he simply asked, "Did I waste your life?" Joanne looked genuinely startled. "No." But she hesitated too long afterward, and that hesitation told him everything. The drive home felt quieter. Not hostile, just thoughtful in a way they had avoided for years. As they approached Red Deer again, Joanne suddenly said, "You know, Ryan's angry because he's like you." Larry frowned. "How?" "He thinks his worth depends on succeeding." Larry stared at the road ahead. "He got that from me." "Yes." Neither spoke for several minutes. Then Joanne added softly, "But maybe he also learned what happens if you build your entire life around proving yourself." That night, Ryan sat at the kitchen table, updating his resume again while Larry watched television without really seeing it. Eventually, Ryan muted the laptop audio. "You and Mom okay?" Larry looked over. "Why?" "You both look weird." Larry almost laughed. "Thanks." Ryan shrugged. "You went somewhere together. That's historic." Joanne smiled from the hallway. "We survived." Ryan leaned back in his chair. "So what's the verdict?" Larry frowned. "On what?" "The business." The room quieted immediately. Larry looked at his son, then at Joanne standing nearby. For the first time in months, maybe years, he did not feel trapped between only two options: sell or don't sell, work, or disappear. Maybe life was less clean than that. Maybe endings happened gradually. Maybe identity could survive change if a man allowed himself to become something beyond usefulness. The thought still frightened him, but less than before. "I don't know yet," he said honestly. Then, after a pause, "But I think I'm starting to understand the question better." Ryan looked confused but nodded anyway. Later that night, Larry stood alone in the backyard beneath clear winter stars. The cold air smelled clean after days of thaw. Inside the house, he could see Joanne moving through the kitchen while Ryan talked from the table. Warm light behind windows. Ordinary life. For years, he had treated home as the place he returned after work. Standing there in the dark, Larry began wondering if he had understood the order backward all along. Chapter 9. Due Diligence. The accountants arrived Monday morning carrying identical black laptop bags and expressions that suggested every room they entered belonged temporarily to them. 2 men and a woman from Calgary. Young, polite, efficient. They set up in the Prairie West conference room with spreadsheets, valuation reports, and bottled water lined carefully across the folding table Larry bought secondhand nearly 20 years earlier. Due diligence. The phrase sounded clinical, harmless. In practice, it felt like strangers dismantling his life into measurable categories. At 9:30, the woman introduced herself as Natalie and asked for 5 years of financial statements. At 10:15, one of the men requested inventory aging reports. At 11, they wanted supplier concentration breakdowns and employee compensation summaries. Every question seemed to reduce decades into data points. Larry stood in the warehouse afterward watching snow fall lightly beyond the loading bay doors while Mitch unloaded a shipment of hydraulic hose fittings. "What's with the funeral face?" Mitch asked. "Nothing." Mitch glanced toward the conference room upstairs. "They poking around already?" "Yeah." Mitch shook his head slowly. "Feels strange?" Larry nodded. That was exactly the problem. It felt strange watching outsiders move confidently through systems he had built from instinct, stress, and improvisation over half a lifetime. One of the accountants appeared downstairs carrying a clipboard. "Larry, quick question about inventory turnover." Larry stared at him a second too long before answering. The young man shifted awkwardly. "You okay?" "Fine." But the words sounded hollow, even to him now. By afternoon, the warehouse no longer felt entirely like his. The accountants moved through aisles photographing inventory. They asked Cheryl about payroll systems and questioned Curtis regarding shipping procedures. Larry watched them all with growing irritation. Not because they were rude, because they were competent. That somehow felt worse. At lunch, he escaped to the parking lot and sat alone in his truck eating gas station sandwiches he barely tasted. Snow drifted lightly across the windshield. His phone buzzed. "Ryan, you around later?" Larry typed back, "Probably," then added, "Everything okay?" A minute later, "Yeah, just got an interview." Larry stared at the message longer than necessary. Finally, "That's good." No response came after. The exchange left him strangely sad. So much of fatherhood now existed through brief practical texts. Information transferred without emotional weight attached. At 40 years old, Larry might not have noticed. At 51, he noticed constantly. When he returned inside, he found Natalie from accounting standing in his office holding an old framed photograph. "What's this from?" Larry looked at it. Prairie West Equipment, 1997. The original warehouse staff standing outside the first building beside a rusted forklift and crooked sign. Larry was 32 in the picture, thin, dark-haired. Certain exhaustion could always be outworked. 3 of the men in the photo were dead now. Another drank himself into disability after the oil crash. One moved to Saskatchewan and vanished from everyone's life. Natalie smiled politely. "You built this from scratch?" Larry nodded. "That's impressive." He surprised himself by feeling irritated instead of proud. "Doesn't matter much now." She set the photo down carefully. "I think it probably matters a lot." But once she left, the office felt emptier somehow. At 4:30, Cheryl entered carrying payroll reports. "You should go home." Larry looked up. "What?" You've been pacing around like someone died. I'm working. No, she said gently. You're haunting the building. The sentence hit him unexpectedly hard. He laughed quietly through his nose. That obvious? To everybody. She hesitated near the door. You know the place isn't you, right? Larry looked at her. People kept saying versions of this lately. Ryan, Joanne, now Cheryl. And each time, some stubborn, exhausted part of him resisted believing it. Because if Prairie West wasn't him anymore, then what exactly remained underneath? That evening at home, Ryan sat at the kitchen table wearing a collared shirt Larry had never seen before. Interview? Larry asked. Ryan nodded. Industrial sales company in Calgary. Larry removed his coat slowly. What kind? Equipment distribution. Larry laughed despite himself. Jesus Christ! What? You escaped one version of me to become another. Ryan smiled faintly. Maybe. Joanne emerged from the kitchen carrying plates. How'd it go? Good, I think. Ryan looked toward Larry. They asked about Prairie West, actually. Larry frowned. Why? They recognized the company name. A strange, complicated feeling moved through him then. Not pride exactly, but something adjacent to it. You say anything stupid? Larry asked. Ryan laughed. Probably. They ate dinner together quietly. Nothing dramatic happened. No arguments, no revelations. Just three people sharing food while winter darkness settled outside the windows. And somehow that ordinary calm felt unfamiliar after years of tension humming beneath everything. Later, Ryan knocked lightly on the garage door where Larry sat sorting old tools he never used anymore. You hiding? Thinking. Ryan entered carrying 2 beers. You do most of your thinking in garages. Larry accepted one. Occupational habit. Ryan sat nearby on an overturned bucket. For several minutes they drank silently while the garage heater ticked overhead. Then Ryan spoke. You know something weird? Larry waited. When I was younger, I thought you loved work more than us. Larry stared at the beer bottle in his hand. That's not true. I know. Ryan leaned back against the wall. I think you were just scared all the time. The sentence landed softly now instead of accusingly. Larry nodded once. Probably. Ryan looked genuinely surprised by the admission. You admit that pretty easy suddenly. Larry laughed quietly. Getting tired of pretending otherwise. The garage settled into silence again. Finally, Larry spoke without planning to. My father never said he was scared. Ryan listened carefully. He worked constantly, broke himself physically, but he treated fear like something shameful. Larry rubbed at a stain on the workbench absent-mindedly. So I figured being a man meant carrying everything quietly. Ryan nodded slowly. That sounds exhausting. It was. The honesty startled both of them slightly. Ryan rolled the beer bottle between his palms. You know, I used to think success meant becoming important enough nobody could ignore you. Larry looked at him. And now? Ryan shrugged. Now I think maybe it's just being present while your life happens. The words settled heavily inside the garage. Larry thought about hockey arenas, middle-of-the-night drives, Joanne wading through years of postponements, Prairie West consuming every available piece of emotional energy because work always felt measurable in ways relationships did not. You sound older lately, Larry said. Ryan smiled faintly. Losing things helps. After Ryan went inside, Larry remained sitting alone for nearly an hour. The garage smelled faintly of cold air, dust, and engine oil. He looked around at shelves packed with objects saved for later. Projects postponed indefinitely, equipment unused for years, entire parts of himself waiting for some future moment when life finally slowed down enough to experience properly. And suddenly, for the first time since the offer arrived, Larry understood something clearly. He had spent decades treating life as preparation for itself, always enduring the present in exchange for a future stability that never fully arrived. One more busy year, one more difficult season, one more expansion, then eventually he would relax, Eventually, he would become available. Eventually, he would live, but eventually had become 51 years old, standing in a cold garage wondering where everything went. The realization sat inside him quietly, not dramatic, just true. Upstairs, he could hear Joanne laughing faintly at something Ryan said in the kitchen. The sound drifted down through the floorboards, warm, ordinary, still available if he wanted it. Chapter 10. Closing time. The final meeting was scheduled for Thursday morning. By then, the snow had begun melting in earnest. Parking lots turned gray with slush. Roofs dripped steadily through the afternoons. The city carried that exhausted late winter feeling where everything looked partially dissolved. Larry arrived at Prairie West before dawn anyway. Habit still woke him at 5. The warehouse stood silent beneath pale streetlights while meltwater ran along the edges of the loading bays. Inside, the familiar smells greeted him immediately. Dust, oil, coffee, cold concrete. For a long moment, he stood alone near reception, listening to the building breathe around him. 30 years, half his life measured inside these walls. He walked slowly through the aisles before turning on the lights. Inventory stacked neatly to the ceiling. Old stains in the concrete from forklifts long gone. Shelving repaired 3 different ways over decades. He remembered nearly everything. Where the first office desk had stood. Which pipe burst during the flood winter. Where Dennis used to smoke secretly despite company policy. Where Ryan once sat doing homework after school because Joanne was working late. The memories arrived without order. Not dramatic moments. Just accumulated life. At 6:30, Mitch showed up carrying coffee. "You're early even for you." Larry smiled faintly. Couldn't sleep. Mitch handed him a cup. "You decide?" Larry looked out across the warehouse. "Yeah." Mitch nodded once as though he already knew the answer. Neither spoke for a while. Finally, Mitch said quietly, "Well, hell of a run." The sentence hit harder than congratulations would have. Around 9, the Calgary group arrived. Same black coats, same leather folders, same calm professional energy. But today, Larry noticed something different. They were not villains. Just people doing work. The realization removed some of the bitterness he'd been carrying. Inside the conference room, paperwork spread across the folding table. Purchase agreements, transition timelines, asset schedules. Natalie from accounting reviewed final details while Graham Porter watched Larry carefully from across the room. "You comfortable proceeding?" Graham asked. Larry looked down at the documents. His name appeared everywhere, signatures waiting. Entire decades condensed into legal language. For a brief moment, panic rose sharply inside him, a primitive instinct screaming not to let go. Because once he signed, the version of himself built around Prairie West would begin ending officially. He thought about his father dying in a parking lot before retirement. He thought about Joanne waiting through endless, busy years. He thought about Ryan staring toward hockey arena doors, hoping his father would arrive before the game ended. Then he thought about standing alone in the dark kitchen at 2 a.m, realizing he no longer knew how to exist without problems to solve. Larry picked up the pen. His hand shook slightly, and signed, just like that. No dramatic music, no revelation, only ink moving across paper while fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. When it was done, Graham extended his hand. "Congratulations." Larry shook it automatically. The word felt strange. Congratulations, as though something had been won cleanly instead of surrendered slowly over decades. The meeting ended before noon. People gathered paperwork, laptops closed, future plans discussed, transition schedules established. Larry answered questions mechanically while feeling oddly detached from his own body. Then suddenly, the conference room emptied, and he was alone again. The silence pressed hard against him. He sat down slowly. Outside the warehouse window, Mitch drove the forklift across the loading bay exactly as he had yesterday and would tomorrow. Work continuing, life continuing. Larry expected relief. Instead, he felt grief arrive first. Not overwhelming, just deep and quiet, like standing beside something already disappearing. Around 1:30, he walked downstairs. Mitch looked up immediately. Well? Larry nodded once. Mitch exhaled through his nose. Guess that's that. Word spread quickly. Cheryl hugged him unexpectedly. Curtis shook his hand awkwardly. A few employees congratulated him while others looked uncertain about their own futures. Larry understood all of it. By late afternoon, the warehouse returned mostly to normal. Orders still shipped, phones still rang, forklifts still moved. The world stubbornly refused to pause for personal turning points. At 4:30, Larry entered his office and closed the door. The room looked exactly the same. Desk cluttered with invoices, coffee stains on old paperwork. The photograph from 1997 still leaning against the filing cabinet. 32-year-old Larry staring confidently into a future he believed hard work could control. Larry sat down heavily. For years, this office had contained every version of his stress. Fear, responsibility, purpose. Now it felt temporary already. He opened the desk drawer and found an old hockey photo buried beneath contracts. Ryan, at 12 years old, holding a tournament trophy beside teammates. Larry stood at the edge of the frame, half distracted, cell phone clipped visibly to his belt. He stared at the image a long time, then laughed softly at himself. Not bitterly, just tired. At 6, he finally locked the office. Mitch waited near the front entrance, pulling on his coat. You heading out? Yeah. Mitch nodded toward the dark warehouse. Never figured this place without you. Larry looked back through the glass. Me neither. Outside, evening sunlight reflected off dirty, melting snowbanks. The air smelled faintly of thawing earth beneath winter rot. Larry locked the front door carefully, the same door he'd unlocked thousands of mornings before sunrise. For a moment, he simply stood there holding the keys. Then he handed them to Mitch. Don't lose those, Mitch snorted. Jesus. Don't make it emotional. Larry laughed genuinely this time. The sound surprised both of them. When he got home, Joanne was making dinner while Ryan sat at the kitchen table reviewing paperwork from his Calgary interview. Both looked up immediately. Well? Joanne asked. Larry removed his coat slowly. I signed. Silence filled the kitchen. Then Joanne crossed the room and hugged him tightly. Larry held her longer than usual. Over her shoulder, he saw Ryan watching quietly. How do you feel? Joanne asked. Larry considered lying automatically. Fine, good, relieved. Instead, he answered truthfully. Scared. Joanne nodded against his shoulder. Me too. That evening, they ate together while snowmelt dripped steadily outside the windows. Conversation wandered through practical things at first. Transition timelines. Money. Ryan's possible move to Calgary. But beneath all of it sat something else. Not happiness exactly. Possibility. After dinner, Ryan helped clear the table without being asked. Joanne opened a bottle of wine they'd been saving for years. At one point, Larry caught himself checking the time automatically, calculating tomorrow's workload before remembering. The realization stopped him cold for a second. Tomorrow would happen without him needing to carry all of it alone. The thought felt terrifying and freeing. Later that night, unable to sleep, Larry stepped outside into the backyard. The air had softened considerably. Snowbanks shrank beneath moonlight. Somewhere nearby, water dripped steadily from eavesdrows. Inside the house, he could see Joanne reading on the couch while Ryan laughed quietly at something on television. His family. Still here. Larry stood in the darkness with his hands in his pockets and realized something simple. Work had not ruined his life, but it had consumed enough of it that he nearly forgot life was happening simultaneously elsewhere. The tragedy was not that he worked too hard. The tragedy was how easily years disappeared while he believed he was postponing living until later, and now later had arrived, not as triumph, not as failure, just as time. The neighborhood sat quiet beneath the thawing Alberta night. For the first time in decades, Larry had nowhere he absolutely needed to be before sunrise. The thought no longer felt entirely like erasure, only unfamiliar. And somewhere inside that unfamiliar silence, very faintly, something that might eventually become peace began trying to take shape.